I say redundant because I've already said these, but I'll say them again. The final exam is Monday. Starts at 8 a.m. It'll be online as usual. I'm going to try to post it a little bit early as usual. So, as soon as you see that final exam, you can start it. Just make sure you're done by 9:50 a.m. Anything after that, every minute will be 10 points off. So don't turn it in late. If something goes wrong, stop taking the exam and contact me and we can make other arrangements. I do need to hold a review. Well, I don't need to. I want to hold a review. I still don't know when. I'm hoping maybe Thursday afternoon, tentatively. But if anybody has any requests, send me an email about when we're going to do the final exam review. Your review, or if you decide to come to the review, what you need to do before that is look at the first 3 exams and the last 3 study guides, because those are the questions I'm going to use to write the 100 question exam. Yeah, that's about it for the final exam. Any questions about the final exam? All right. And again, as usual, if you want to take a paper version or for some reason you can't take it at the scheduled time, contact me beforehand and we can make different arrangements. If you missed the final exam and I haven't heard from you beforehand and you send me an email at 11 a.m. on Monday and said, oh, I slept in, or I didn't know the final exam was on Monday, because I hear that all the time, you'll fail. You'll just get an automatic 0. If you miss the exam because you've been missing all these announcements I keep putting out there, that's just a 0 that you can keep. That's it. Announcements. What else? Sorry. Lab. Again, as a reminder, this week's lab is online, and all you need to do is go back and pick your old lab. Pick any old lab that was a bad grade and fix it, and then let me know which one you're fixing. That's all you need to do for lab this week. Let me know if you need help. That's it. Attendance we'll do as usual. If you're online, send me an email, and pay attention to this, all of you, because some of you I can tell are not paying attention to this, not you in person. But for those of you online, just because I see you online does not mean that your attendance is good. You need to send me the keywords. So after I'm done giving the lecture, send me an email with the keywords, please. And then, for anybody watching the video, obviously, you'll have the questions. So any questions about attendance, labs, or final? All right. I guess the last announcement, since I see people coming in, hopefully some more people will come in. The thing about the grades, I've been begging you guys to worry about your grade all semester. So I'm telling you now, it's pretty much too late. Like, work hard for your grade, but please don't contact me the day after the final and say, I didn't do so good. I'm not good at testing. I'm worried about my scholarship, because I've been telling you all semester to work on your grades. So once the final is done, that's it, man. The time is up. So sorry to be a Debbie Downer, but it's a Wednesday. I wanted to do it on a Wednesday and not a Monday, because, it's hump day. We're halfway through the day, so hopefully people will be in a better mood for it. Any questions about anything before we jump back into Chapter 20? All right, let's jump into Chapter 20. The first word for attendance, let's keep it simple, will be, let's do structure as the first word for attendance today, structure. Advance, since you're in person, if you could email me to remind me that you were here, you'll get a little bit of extra credit for being in person as opposed to being online. All right, let's get this party started, this slideshow started. Here's where we left off. We left off talking about interspecific interactions. We were talking about quite a few of them, and you need to be able to recognize them on the exam. They're pretty simple. You probably have heard about these your entire life. Interspecific competition. So that's when 2 different species are competing against resources. Mutualism, where it's good for both of the different species. Sometimes it's so good that it's like they don't survive without each other. Predation, that's when one species eats another one, like when we're talking about animals. Herbivory, that's when an animal eats a plant, right? All simple stuff. The next one's also pretty simple. The next thing we're going to talk about are parasites and pathogens. So let's move forward. Parasites, you probably already know this, but that's something that lives on or in a host. And when they're living on or in the host, they obtain nutrients. And that is beneficial for one species and harmful for the other. So think about like the example we used for mutualism. The example we used for mutualism was that algae that's living inside of the coral. that was not a parasite because it wasn't beneficial for one and harmful for the other. It was beneficial for both. So that was mutualism. The thing that makes a parasite is it has to be good for one, bad for the other. So your book gives some examples: tapeworms, roundworms, ticks, lice, mosquitoes. There's a bunch of them. You can look them up if you want. They're actually really fascinating. It's a good independent work topic if you're interested. For example, what was it? They found back in the day, people who were chewing tobacco were less likely to get hookworms, I think it was, than other people. And it's really interesting the way it works. It's because hookworms, their eggs are out on the ground, and people used to walk around barefoot back in the day. Well, we still do, but a lot more back then. And then after it rained, it would kind of like activate the eggs. So then they would come out and just be waiting to touch some flesh. So then when people walk barefooted, it would go into your flesh, and literally they travel through your flesh up into your lungs. And once they make it inside your lungs, that's where they lay their eggs. And then when you cough and then swallow that, then those eggs make it into your stomach. They hatch, and then you poop out the little baby tapeworm or little baby hookworms, and the cycle. And then technically, I guess your poop goes out somewhere else, and then the worms are back on the ground, and the cycle continues. But what happens with people who chew tobacco is, they'd have the hookworms in their hookworm eggs in their lungs. They'd cough them up, but then because they're chewing tobacco, they would spit whatever it is that they coughed up. So those people were less likely to get the intestinal infection. Not that you need to know that. I just thought it was interesting. Point is, there's a bunch of little interesting stories like that when it comes to parasites. So look it up if you want for independent work. Anyway, those are parasites. Know them for the exam. Pathogens. All right, if you're taking notes, you could just write pathogens equals diseases, right? That's basically what we mean. Could be a bacteria disease, could be a viral disease, could be a fungus, could be a protist. That'd be another good, interesting thing to look up for independent work. I think most of us are obviously very familiar with virus diseases. Obviously, we're in the middle of COVID-19 right now. Well, not in the middle of it, but whatever, right? So we're familiar with viral diseases. Bacteria diseases, you're probably very familiar with that, like infections, pneumonia, things like that. But if you want to look it up for independent work, what about some good fungi diseases? Some of them are deadly. What about protist diseases? We've talked about one of them when we talked about sickle cell disease. We talked about malaria. Also, I don't know, you might look this up, or never mind, I don't have time to get into it. But there's a fine line between a protist pathogen and a protist parasite, because a protist is, well, whatever. Anyway, any questions about this slide? It's going to be pretty simple for the exam. Otherwise, there would be a lot more to say about this. There's a whole course built on this one slide. All right. Next thing we're going to talk about is commensalism, and this will be the last of the interspecific interactions we discuss. Commensalism is when one species benefits and the other is not helped or harmed. So far, everything else we've talked about is it's good for both species, or it's good for one species and bad for the other. And this one, it's like it's good for one species and the other one's like, doesn't really help it or hurt it. A good example of that from your book is that seahorses benefit by matching coral to hide, right? So that's a situation where it helps the seahorse, but the coral is like, all right, take it or leave it. It does not affect the coral one way or the other. Obviously, that's just an example. You're not going to need to know that for the exam. You just need to know that commensalism is when one species is harmed and the other one, one species benefits and the other one's kind of neutral. So I would, in the exam, if you were to get that question, I'd give you some example that hopefully you've never heard of, but you should recognize it. Okay, this one species did good. This other species didn't affect them one way or the other. And then you should say, oh yeah, that's commensalism. So any questions about commensalism? All right. Here's a chart that kind of sums up everything we've talked about with the interspecies interactions, interspecific interactions. So we have competition, which is, technically bad for both. You have mutualism, which is good for both. You have predation, which is good for one, bad for the other. Herbivory, good for one, bad for the other. Parasites and pathogens, good for one, bad for the other. One thing I didn't say about parasites, and some might even argue viruses, depending on how you look at it, and you don't need to know this for the exam, but another interesting thing about parasites is they don't necessarily want to kill the host, right? Think about that, because if they're living off the host, they want nutrients from the host, but they also don't want to kill them. So like, for example, like a tapeworm, a human tapeworm, or a tapeworm that you would find in a human, the perfect balance would be taking so many nutrients that the tapeworm itself is doing great, right? Getting a lot of nutrients from the human. But if it takes too many nutrients from the human, then the human dies, right? So it's got to have that perfect balance between getting as much as it can without killing the host. Anyway, any questions about this chart? Again, this chart, this table, it just shows everything we've talked about in one handy little slide. All right, the next word for attendance will be bear. Like that picture right there of that animal who's caught a fish. It is a bear. All right, that's good. Now that we're done with interspecific interactions, we're going to talk about trophic structure. This is actually a very relevant topic to humans, to us, to you non-biology majors. Interspecific interactions, that's pretty specific to biology majors, right? I'll admit that probably you're not going to learn, that information is not going to be too valuable to you outside of this course. But trophic structure, it is important when it comes to understanding how the environment works. And that's important when it comes to decisions you make as a voter and decisions you make as a consumer and things like that. But anyway, let's jump into it. Trophic structure is the feeding relationships among species in a community. So you most commonly hear food chains and food webs, and we're going to discuss that. But yeah, so when you think of trophic structure, just think food chains, food webs. We're talking about, what eats what. The trophic structure determines the passage of energy and nutrients from plants to herbivores to predators. This that bullet point right there is basically an introduction to what we're about to talk about. That's a true statement, and you kind of need to know it to understand what I'm about to say. But again, it's just an introduction, so we're going to talk about this bullet point in more detail. I put a little star next to the word plants because that's not always how the trophic structure works. This is how we describe it in Bio 101 because it's the most basic, but think about it. It depends on how you look at it. The plants are the autotrophs, so the plants are the things that are taking inorganic material like carbon dioxide and water and making nutrients, right, with the energy from the sun. However, they also do get some of their nutrients from the soil, not all of them, but some of them from the soil. And those nutrients were probably made available to them by decomposers. But then again, you could also argue that the only reason that the decomposers could make those nutrients available is because they were decomposing dead plants or dead animals, in which case, again, the plants were the ones that originated. The autotrophs were the ones that originated the energy. Anyway, we'll come back to that concept. Otherwise, I would ask if you have questions, but we'll hold off on that. So the sequence of transfer between trophic levels is called the food chain. You guys already know what a food chain is. That's the official book definition. Here's what it looks like. A food chain, right? It's very simple. When we're trying to simplify it, we're just talking from level to level. So again, the bottom level, the level that starts it all, is the plants, right? Or the autotrophs, really. Those are called your primary producers. And then above that, you have your primary consumers, which should make sense, right? You have your primary producers. These are the things that are producing. And then you have the things that are consuming. And that what comes after primary? Secondary. So that should be pretty easy for you to remember as well. What comes after secondary? Tertiary. And what comes after tertiary? Sometimes if there's enough energy in the ecosystem, you have quaternary. You do need to know that for the exam. What you don't need to know are these examples. If this was a higher level course, or if this was an actual ecology course, then maybe, yes, you should know some examples of, like, I don't know, a secondary consumer versus a tertiary consumer, but you don't need to know that. What you need to know is that primary producers are the plants and all the autotrophs, and that the primary consumers eat those, and the secondary consumers eat those, and the tertiary consumers eat those, and so on and so forth. So any questions about this slide? We'll talk about it a little bit more. Okay. So again, like that last slide showed, now you're just seeing it in words, herbivores are primary consumers. So excuse me, when I said you didn't need to know examples, that was true. Like, let me back up one slide, right? That herbivore is a grasshopper, right? So I'm not going to give you questions like, What is a grasshopper? Is it a primary consumer, secondary consumer? You don't need to know that, because again, it's a 100 level course, so I don't expect you to know what kind of animals are herbivores, but you do need to know that herbivores, whatever species they may be, those are your primary consumers, which makes sense, because hopefully, even before you had this class, you knew that herbivores were things that ate plants. So if you can remember that plants are the producers, then surely the first consumers must be the things that eat those plants. So herbivores are the primary consumers. Please know that for the exam. And again, this is everything, all this information I'm about to give you. I just said it in the past slide, and now it's just in writing for you to read. Above the primary consumers are the carnivores, which eat those primary consumers. Well, we'll just say consumers. That's fine. So again, herbivores eat the producers, and those are the primary consumers. And then carnivores eat consumers. It's just a fancy way of saying things you already know. Herbivores eat plants. Carnivores eat animals. Which, if you want to look this up, then what do you call something that eats fungi? What if they just eat mushrooms? Are there anything that just eat mushrooms? And again, if so, what do they call those? Because again, a mushroom, as you can see down here, that's a decomposer. So a mushroom, it's not a producer or a consumer. It's a decomposer. So what do you call something that eats that? Good independent work question for you. Anyway, any questions about this slide? Again, it's basically just like the last slide. The last slide, all the information was in the picture. And this slide, all the information is written down for you. All right. If there's no questions, we will move forward. Apologize again that I'm in a rush, but we're a little bit behind. I want to make sure I finish this chapter before the semester is over. Some consumers derive energy from detritus, which is dead material left by all levels. So anything that dies, in this conversation we call detritus, detritus. I've heard it pronounced different ways. Doesn't matter. You don't need to pronounce it. You just need to recognize it if you see it on the exam. Dead material. Maybe the D. D for dead. Right? D for dead. Maybe that'll help you remember it. So there's different species of decomposers, and they consume things in different stages of decay. For example, scavengers, things like crows, vultures, hyenas, right? Those are eating dead carcasses, right? They usually don't kill the thing, but if you drive by roadkill in West Virginia, you'll probably see some crows picking at it, right? And it's not that the crows killed somebody's cat. It's just that somebody's cat got hit by a car and it died, and now the crows are eating it. So yeah, those are scavengers. They consume carcasses. Then we go a level down. Detritivores. These are things that consume decaying organic material. So things like earthworms, millipedes, etc. Actually, let me put some X's through here to remind you. You won't need to know the examples. They consume decaying organic material. And then even smaller, if you go even farther down the line, you get the actual decomposers themselves. And these are basically your single-celled organisms that are really decomposing things, right? These are the things that are secreting enzymes that digest molecules and convert organic materials into inorganic forms. So basically, you just think of it as a hierarchy from larger to smaller. Largest would be scavengers, and smallest would be decomposers. I'm like 95% sure I'm not even going to ask you to differentiate between those three for the exam. If anything, just know that we talk about consumers and producers, but then we also need to throw into the fact that whether you're a producer or a consumer, there are things that decompose you when you die, or if decompose poop, right? So there's consumers, producers, and decomposers, basically the big picture. And you guys probably already knew this from all the science classes you've ever had in your life, or nature videos you've ever watched. So any questions about this? All right. Does anybody know what that's a picture of? Yeah, it's a compost bin. I used to have one. It's pretty good stuff, right? You put all your food scraps in there, and then you have things like detritivores and decomposers that turn your scraps into soil. And what happens is First, the things like the detritivores are eating it, right? So you've got earthworms in there eating it and breaking it down. And then from there, the poop, if you will, of those things is then decomposed and makes pretty good soil. Anyway, are there any questions about the food chain? All right, here's where it gets a little bit more relevant to non-biology majors, something called biomagnification or biological magnification. This is important for your everyday, well, not your everyday life, but it's definitely more important than understanding producers and consumers, because a lot of you non-biology majors will probably never use that term again in your life. All right, so your book points out that organisms cannot metabolize a lot of toxins. So meaning, what that means is, you know, when you eat, for example, meat, and you eat protein, if you remember way back from chapter 3, proteins are made up of amino acids, right? So when you eat meat, your body breaks it down. It's not like you have a long chain of polypeptides in your belly. No, you break it down to all those different amino acids that you need. When you eat starch, you break it down to all those little glucose pieces, right? You break down the polymers into the monomers. What we're saying here is that when it comes to toxins, a lot of organisms can't break down a lot of toxins. So when you eat those toxins, they just stay there. They're in there forever. They don't break it down. They don't digest it. It's just the toxins are in the body. So because of that, they become concentrated as they pass through the food chain. So basically, they start off at low levels, and then the higher you get up the food chain, the more concentrated they get. And this is called biological magnification. This is why, like, if you look into this for independent work, there's certain tunas, like tuna brands, that are safer than others because they, you know, certain tuna species are more dangerous than others. Certain tuna companies do a better job of making sure they tested for certain toxins, and you can go on and on, or you can go on and on for independent work if you want. But anyway, the point is, because there's toxins that are in the environment, that as you go up the food chain, they're higher and higher and higher found in the food. This is why, for example, women who are pregnant or nursing are not recommended to eat certain large fish, because again, the toxins are concentrated. So by the time the human gets it, it's even more concentrated. I could go on and on about this, but I won't. There's a video. I think I've already shared it. If I haven't, I'll share it soon. It's one of those crash courses with that guy named Hank. He does a great job of really showing some animations that really show how it could be like a low level. That's what this means right here. 1 nanogram per gram. Like, it just, if you were to take a zooplankton and look at it, there's just a little bit of whatever toxin. PCBs in this case. That's the particular toxin. Just an example. So there's a little bit of it in the zooplankton. And then if you look at the cod, which eats the zooplankton, it's 10 times more, right? There's 10 nanograms per gram. And then if you look at the salmon, it's almost 10 times more. It's 90 nanograms. So it's 9 times more. And then point is, it gets more concentrated as it goes up. And for this class, that's all you need to know. But again, this is relevant for your everyday life, because this shows, 1, you need to be careful with what you eat. For your own health, you should be careful with what you eat. And 2, it shows you why, you know, when people say there's pollutants in the water and you're like, oh, I don't care, that doesn't concern me. Well, this is why it's important, and not just because it's killing the environment, because also it's bad for human health. So any questions about this slide? Obviously, this is just an example. You don't need to know anything about PCBs. You don't need to know those particular numbers. You don't even need to know those species. What you just need to know, just know that concentrations of toxins increase as you go up the food chain, as you go up the trophic levels. Oop. That's it for biomagnification, right? Pretty simple in this course. So the next thing we're talking about is food webs. You guys are probably already familiar with this too. You're probably already familiar with food chains, which we just talked about. The food chains are not very realistic. They're just a very simplified way of saying, all right, here's the producers, here's the consumers that eat those, here's the consumers that eat those, right? It's just, you're looking at level, from one level to the next. Food webs are just a little bit more realistic, and they show all the actual interactions, right? It's the feeding relationships in a community that are woven into elaborate food webs. So in other words, instead of just going from level to level, as you saw with the food chain, we're going to have an actual web that shows, okay, this species eats all these species, and then that species eats this species and that one, but not this one. It's really complicated, right? It's basically a complicated, more realistic version of a food chain. So here on the left, you have a food chain, right? And that was the nice simple version. You've got the producers and the consumers that eat those and the consumers that eat those. But then on the right, you have the food web, which is a lot more complicated, right? You have, all right, this particular plant is eaten by these particular consumers and these particular omnivores, and then those things are eaten by these things, and it's really complicated. And keep in mind, too, that this is a simplified version of a food web. And also keep in mind, not that I expect anybody to know this, but that's a desert. And desert ecosystems are very, how do I put it, relatively simple, because there's not a lot of biodiversity there. So, you're looking at a very simple version. But again, the point here is that when you're looking at a food web, it's a lot more complicated than just that food chain. There's all these different interactions of all these things that eat this and don't eat that. So anyway, that's it. And I guess the other new information that's presented to you here, where are we at here? Nothing yet, but I'll give you some more here in a second. Anyway, any questions on what a food web is? All right, the next word for attendance is going to be snake. All right, moving forward. Species diversity. So we've already talked about biodiversity in this first main bullet point. Now we're kind of coming back to this concept. We're going to talk about species diversities in communities. So instead of just talking about it and talking about why it's important and talking about the different types of biodiversity and talk about the things that's destroying biodiversity, we're going to look at it now from a more academic point of view and actually talk about how do you quantify biodiversity. So species diversity, that is the variety of species in a community. You should be already familiar with that because, again, when we talked about biodiversity, we talked about 3 different types. We talked about genetic diversity, which is like looking at the gene pool of a particular species. Then we talked about species diversity, which was all the different species living in a community. And then we talked about ecosystem diversity. So you're already familiar with species diversity. Now we're talking about it again. And there's 2 ways of measuring or talking about species diversity. There's species richness, and then there's relative abundance. So imagine, if you will, I wish I could have done this. It would have made class a lot more interesting. Imagine we've got 3 humans in this classroom, but imagine if there was also a dog walking around and a cat and a bird. Maybe it was bring your pet to school day, right? A dog, a cat, a bird, and some humans. If we were talking about species richness, then the species richness of that would be what? Let's see. Dog, cat, human, what did I say, bird? Did I leave anything out? I think that's all I said, right? All right, so 4 species. So if we were talking about that, in that situation, the species richness of this room, at least as far as we can see, that doesn't count all the mold in the air or the mites that live in our skin or the bacteria that live in our gut, right? 4 species. That's species richness. If we were talking about relative abundance, then imagine, instead of just having 3 humans in this room, imagine if there was this was full, like every seat was filled, and we had, I don't know, however many this seat holds, 100 humans. So we have 100 humans and 1 cat and 1 dog and 1 bird. Species richness is still the same, even if this room is filled with humans. What is different then, though, is the relative abundance, because that is the proportional representation of each species. So you do need to know the difference between those for the exam. It's an easy concept. In my opinion, the hardest thing is just going to be making sure you have the right name attached to the right concept. So again, species richness is simply the number of different species. Relative abundance is when you're looking at the percentages. All right, it's mostly this, but there's also this percent of that, so on and so forth. And I'll give you an example moving forward. Here's a picture from your book. Here's 2 different woodlands. And if you look, here we have, let's see, that's 1 species of hardwood. That's species 2, that's some sort of pine tree. Species 3, that's some other sort of pine tree. Species 4, some other kind of pine tree or evergreen, whatever. So here we go. There's 4 species in here in woodland A. And then in woodland B, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4. The same 4 species in woodland B, right? 4 species. So if you got this picture on the exam and it said, what is the species richness of these 2 woodlands? The answer would be 4. Or if the question said, which one has greater species richness, woodland A or woodland B? The answer would be, it's a trick question. They're equal because they both have 4 species. So as far as species richness is concerned, they're equal. However, relative abundance, again, is looking at the percentages. So if you need to, clear your mind, forget everything we just said, and just think common sense, right? Look at woodland A, look at woodland B. Can someone tell me, and this is not a trick question because one is more diverse than the other, which one has more biodiversity, woodland A or woodland B? B, good. Remind me you said that for a little extra credit for attendance today. Because even though they have the same 4 species, it's a better mix in woodland B, right? Woodland A is almost entirely that hardwood, maybe that oak or whatever it may be. So yeah, the answer would be woodland B has greater relative abundance. So any questions about this slide or relative abundance or species richness? All right. And then, yeah, there's everything we just saw, but in a graph. Yeah, we love graphs in science. Anyway, this brings us to a new concept. Well, new to our discussions. I don't know if you've heard of them before, but a keystone species. This is one whose impact is much larger than its total mass or abundance indicates. For example, let me back up. You might consider, like if we're looking at woodland A up here, where's my thing? Whatever species this is, the one that's all over the place, you're like, all right, that's a very important species in that that community, in that ecosystem. You'd be right? Because it makes up most of it. So common sense will tell you by looking at that, like, okay, that's a very important species because, let me look back at the wording used here. Okay, because of the abundance, because of the relative abundance, right? There's a large abundance of that tree in that woodland. So common sense will tell you that that's an important species. Now, a different situation is when it doesn't look like that. Like what if you look at woodland B, let me do it like this so you guys can hear me online, and it's, I don't know, what if it's this like bluish colored tree, right? And what if I told you that was like a very, very important species in the ecosystem? You can't tell by looking, right? You can't tell that that thing is just as prevalent as the other ones. So there's nothing about its relative abundance that says well, that's a very important species. So what we were talking about is, again, something where you can't tell by looking at its abundance or its total mass. You can't tell by looking at that, but it is an important species. Your book gives an example. Obviously, again, because it's an example, you don't need to know it for the exam. It might be on the study guide. There's a predator, which is called, in this instance, in this example, the predator is a sea star or starfish, however you might want to call it. Some people took those and removed them from an ecosystem, right, as an experiment. And the things that they ate, mainly their mussels, because of they got rid of the predator of those mussels, the mussels outcompeted other species, right? So the mussels and other species were eating things, right? They were eating producers. But because the things that ate the mussels were taken away, the mussels blew up. Not literally, but their population grew. So they started out competing the other species. So what happened then was the other species started to decline, and I'll show you a picture of what I'm talking about. These are, again, just an example. Actually, this is different. Shoot. Anyway, yeah, I don't have a picture, or do I? Yeah, there we go. There's the picture I was looking for. So with the sea star, it was able to eat those mussels, and then therefore the mussels were not able to outcompete. But then when you get rid of that one species, then the mussels were able to outcompete a bunch of stuff, and therefore species diversity went down. And again, that's from just removing one species, and that's what makes it a keystone species, right? Because notice, like when you take away this one species right here, it's not like the graph should be the same, right? You would expect it maybe just to be a little bit lower because you only removed one species. But what happened was there was a cascading effect. You removed the one species, and because of that, you lost a bunch of others. Another example, not from your book, is that picture I skipped over. Sea otters, that is a keystone species because the sea otters eat these sea urchin and they keep them in check. So when there's no sea otters, the sea urchins are overpopulated. And when the sea urchins are overpopulated, they eat all the kelp, which kills the kelp. And it's not just like, oh, no, that's so sad the kelp is gone, but there's a lot of things that live in the kelp. Like that's an ecosystem, that's a habitat for so many species. So when you lose the kelp, you lose those species of the things that live in the kelp. And then, of course, you lose the species of the things that ate the things that lived in the kelp, right? So again, that's a keystone species. It's just the one species, but when you remove it, you lose a lot of other ones. So any questions about what a keystone species is? All right. The next thing we're going to talk about is disturbances in secession and communities. I'm going to kind of go through this quickly. It's kind of simple. I'll try to go easy on it as far as the exam is concerned, maybe not have any questions at all. I don't know yet, because in my opinion, this is something that's not extremely important for your non-biology lives. But anyway, what is a disturbance? If anything, you might need to know that. Those are episodes that damage communities, at least temporarily, destroying organisms and altering the availability of resources. Basically, it's a change, something that changed the ecosystem. So if you had a hurricane come through, that's going to change the ecosystem, right? Because you're going to knock down some trees. You're probably going to change the sand. I don't have time to get into it, but yeah, hurricanes, like volcanoes, things like that. Storms. I forgot. I have examples right in front of me. Droughts, things that temporarily make changes. And your book does point out, and if anything, this is important, if anything from this slide, small-scale natural disturbances have a positive effects on biological communities. So you might think, oh, when you destroy stuff, it's bad. Common sense will tell you that. But that's not always true. Here's an example. Here we go. We had an ecosystem. A storm knocked down this tree. And now, because of this, we have new situations, right? Now we have this little pond right here. There didn't used to be a pond in these woods, but now there's a big crater left from that tree. And now there's a pond. So imagine you're out in the woods. The things that live in woods are a lot different than the things that live in ponds, right? Now in the ponds, we've got some prokaryotes. We've got some algae. Maybe we got some tadpoles. Maybe, I doubt it, with that being small, but maybe there's some little fish, crawfish, maybe, whatever. The point is, you had a change in the ecosystem, and now you have more diversity because you've got new habitats. That's the most basic way to put it. Oh, guys, I'm sorry. I hate to do this. I'm about to run out. I'll be right back. I'm actually sick, and I've been trying to avoid this, but I can't. So I'll be right back. I'm so sorry. So sorry. At least I avoided getting physically sick in the room. That's good. Anyway, what are we talking about? Disturbances. Yes. Okay. So again, natural disturbances, small-scale disturbances, they're usually a good thing. That's something you should know for the exam. On the flip side of that, if it's not natural or if it's not small, then it could be bad. Specifically, humans. Humans are the most significant agent of ecological disturbance. And again, not necessarily the good ones. Because if they're not small or natural, then they're usually not good. One consequence is the emergence of previously unknown diseases. This is amazing. This was written before COVID-19. And this is basically describing COVID-19. I'll put a big old X through all that. But basically, as far as we know, COVID-19 jumped from one species, one other animal species into the human population, right? Because what happens is humans are encroaching on other animals, especially certain, let's leave it at that. We are encroaching on other animals' habitats, and therefore diseases that used to be among certain other species are now finding their way into humans. And to throw it back to what you've already learned in previous chapters, that is from mutation. Because usually viruses are very specific to what kind of animals they can attack. But if there's a mutation, there could be a virus that used to only affect bats. But then now with the mutation, it can then affect humans or infect humans. So anyway, that's just an example. Any questions about disturbances? All right. The next keyword for attendance will be sick, since I am sick. And don't worry, it's not an airborne sickness I have. It's a foodborne sickness or digestive sickness that I've acquired from my elementary school-aged son. He gave this to me. Not happy. Anyway, let's talk about ecological succession. So basically, when we're talking about disturbances, right? So disturbances kind of, well, they disturb things. In some cases, disturbances completely wipe things out, in which case you're starting over if you're talking about an ecosystem. And that's what we're going to talk about is succession. If you're not in biology class, like seriously, if you can get your brain to do this, think about the fact or ignore the fact that you're in biology. If you're just having a conversation with somebody and someone says, hey, what is succession? What does that mean to you? When you don't think anything about biology, what does that word succession mean to anybody else? When you think of the word succession, what does that mean? What is it? Moving on. Moving on, good. And yeah, and it is moving on. That is correct. Not what I was thinking, but that is just as correct as what I was thinking. Anybody else?
One after the other.
One after the other, good. You guys are getting to where I was thinking. Who said that? Hamrick?
Yeah.
Hey, good guess. All right. Well, remind me that you guessed for independent or for extra credit. How about if you were in a political science class and they said, today we're going to talk about secession, or a government class, whatever, U.S. government class, political science, whatever it is, what would they be talking about? That's okay. I was hoping somebody would know. In political science or in the U.S. government, when they talk about secession, they're like, all right, well, when the president dies, you get the vice president. And when the vice president dies, you get the Speaker of the House, right? So on and so forth. That's secession. Basically, like you guys have said, it's what steps up to fill the role, right? So ecological succession is basically the same thing. All right, if this dies, then what steps up? Well, if these things die, then what steps up? Well, what if all these things die, then what steps up? So it's sort of like that. It's a progression of the species that take over, right? So if a disturbance comes in and wipes everything out to some extent, then we have new species come in and start things over. And there's different types. And your book simplifies it into primary succession, which is the first one. That's primary, and you need to know this. Primary succession is when the disturbance has completely wiped everything out. Like you're really starting from new when we're talking about the ecosystem. There's no plants, there's no animals, there's not even any soil. So for example, like if a volcano goes off and you have lava, right? Lava comes in, it covers everything and it turns to stone, right? So that is literally a brand new ecosystem. There's nothing there. There's no soil. The only thing that's going to be there is at first are the mold that's in the air, the bacteria that's in the air, anything like that might be in the air that settles on the rock, right? That would be at first. But anyway, that's primary succession. The most important thing for you to know for primary succession is that it's when you're starting completely over. Virtually lifeless area with no soil. Of course, this picture I chose is a little bit after primary succession has already started because we actually have plants growing. Not that you need to know that, but if there's plants, vascular plants, which I don't expect you to know either, but there's plants other than moss. So that means you're a little bit past primary succession. But yeah, without going into too much information because you don't need to know it, it's a different set of species. Like the species that show up for primary succession are different than the ones I'm about to show you. Because again, if you have a barren area of rock, you can think about it. Some species are going to grow on the barren area of rock, while others aren't, right? You can't plant a palm tree on a rock, for example, right? But you can probably imagine with enough water, you might get some moss growing on a rock. So in the back of your mind, just know if it's primary succession or versus the other succession, you're going to have different species doing it. But for the exam, know that primary succession is when you're starting completely over. Another example other than lava would be glaciers. Think about as glaciers melt, they're just big, huge sheets of ice, bigger than Hamlin Hall, thicker than Hamlin Hall, taller than Hamlin Hall. And when they melt away, the only thing that's left there is just the rocks that have been frozen for tens of thousands of years. So there's essentially no life, at least no soil, no plants, anything like that. Anyway, that's primary succession. As you might imagine, the other one that we're going to talk about is called secondary succession. And the easy way to remember this for this exam, for this 100 level non-majors biology course is primary succession is when you lose everything and you're starting completely over. Secondary succession is not that. It's just that simple, right? So this is when there are some stuff left over. There are some things left over. So like if you have a flood and it destroys all the trees, right? Maybe even washes away all the plants somehow. And the only thing you're left with is a bunch of mud. Well, you still have the mud, so that's soil. So that's not primary succession. That is secondary succession. And again, not for the exam, but for your own knowledge, there would be different types of species that show up for secondary succession than would be for primary. So any questions about primary or secondary succession? If you're into it, you can look it up for independent work. What are the typical primary succession species? What are the typical secondary succession species? So that's it for the second main bullet point, which is good. That means we are halfway through the chapter, even though we're almost done with the halfway point of the week. So let's jump into it quickly. Ecosystem ecology. We've already been kind of talking about this a little bit. Now we're just going to get into more detail. As you already know, so I'm going to say this quickly because I've said it a million times in this chapter and other chapters before. An ecosystem is a community of species, right? All the different species that are interacting together, which are the biotic factors, plus all the abiotic factors. So you're not just talking about how this species eats that species, which is the parasite of that species, which feeds this species, right? We're not just talking about how these species interact. We're also talking about the abiotic factors. How much rain does it get? What's the typical temperatures? How much shade does it get? How much sunshine does it get? All these things that aren't living but affect the living things. You don't need to know those specific examples, but I will ask you a question of like, which of these is an abiotic factor? Or which of these is not an abiotic factor? And again, if it's an abiotic, that means it's not living. So if I say the pH of the soil, that's an abiotic factor. If I say the bacteria living in the soil, that's a biotic factor, right? Because one's living, one's not. You don't need to know this. This is just an example. But a terrarium is a community that interacts with abiotic factors. Let me just say this. A terrarium is basically an ecosystem that's enclosed. And I'll just show you a picture. It'll be a lot easier. There's a terrarium, right? That is an enclosed ecosystem. And they do have them. I might have a picture on the next slide. No, I don't. Anyway, there are like closed-in ecosystems where there's nothing coming in. It's sealed off to the environment. So there's no animals or air or plants or anything coming in or out. And that the important concept here is the fact that when you have it sealed off, then all the chemicals are recycled, right? All the oxygen, in the air is used. All the carbon dioxide is in the air and it's used. And you know about the cycle of that from chapters 6 and 7. So all the nutrients in this box will stay there. They'll just keep being recycled. Autotrophs will build new things with them, and then they'll die and be decomposed, and those will be broken down into basic parts again, and the cycle continues. So what you need to know for the exam is, in an ecosystem, chemicals are recycled. But in an ecosystem, energy flows through it, right? So there's this light energy that these plants are using to build new molecules, but that energy eventually is going to be lost as heat, right? Yes, that energy is put into making those new bonds of the glucose, as you learned in chapter 6 or 7. But when you break those bonds in respiration to make ATP, remember, only 34% of that energy is actually put to work. The rest of it is lost as heat. So again, important thing for the exam is chemicals, or matter, if you will, is recycled in an ecosystem, and energy flows through it. That's the important concept for the exam. So energy flow and chemical cycling involve the transfer of substances through trophic levels, very obvious. Again, I'm going to put an X at this top part because it's these bottom two that you need to know that I've already said. Energy flows through, chemicals are recycled. Recycled within an ecosystem and between ecosystems. And the reason I guess we should distinguish that is, you know, we have a river running next to us. That's a very specific ecosystem. It's a river ecosystem. So yes, the chemicals are recycled in that ecosystem, but it's also getting inputs from like dead things that fall into the river, like dead leaves that fall into the river, so on and so forth. And that is where we will end this lecture. We'll be back on Friday for a very fast-paced lecture. I guess the last word for attendance will be human. And that's it. I apologize for the sickness. Anybody who was here in person or online will get extra credit. Speaking of which, remind me that you came in late, please. Yeah, that's it. Any questions? If it wasn't for that sickness, we would be exactly where we needed to be right now. I'll be online for office hours if anybody needs me, as always.
I got work till 2:30. Actually, I might be off Thursday.